Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 293. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. Today, here with a first-timer, but someone who has been on our radar for a very long time. I'm just so glad to finally have you here, Mr. Charles Harriott. Charles, how's it going, sir?
It's going great. Really happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, for those who aren't familiar with your wonderful face and your wonderful name, I guess people can't see your face, but if people don't know who you are, why don't you give yourself a quick intro and just tell them?
Yeah. My name's Charles Harriott. I pretty much make my living these days by traveling, teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu seminars, and also making instructionals for BJJ Fanatics. I have a YouTube channel. I have a Patreon. I used to, prior to my life in Jiu-Jitsu, I had a regular job at a natural gas company as a software developer in various other fields. And then I kind of one day made a shift and decided to start traveling. I got involved with BJJ Globetrotters. Christian Gaugart gave me the opportunity to teach at one of his camps in Germany. And that kind of sparked an opportunity that I had to make a living teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then I had another lucky break where I got to meet Bernardo Faria and Mike Zenga in Boston, and they gave me the opportunity to make my first instructional on BJJ Fanatics. With the power of those two things, kind of traveling, teaching seminars and making instructionals, I've been able to make a life. And so about 20 years in Jiu-Jitsu, martial arts since I could walk. And yeah, it's been a great ride, just continuing to grow and learn. And after all this time, I'm still not sick of it. I still really, really love the growth and learning, and especially teaching jiu-jitsu and martial arts in general.
Nice, man. And hey, a fellow software dork as well. Yeah. That's also my background too. I probably have had a similar path and journey as you. I'd be curious to know, why do you think there are so many software people and engineers who fall in love with jiu-jitsu?
I think because if you compare jiu-jitsu to other martial arts, a couple of things stick out that make it really, I guess, kind of palatable to the software developer mind. I don't know if in your office, but in mine, there was a big thing that said, like, there's like the virtues of a good software developer, but they weren't really virtues. Like the number one was like laziness and like procrastination, all these things that seem like negative things. But if you're lazy, you're going to make sure that your software is reusable so you don't have to keep writing it over and over again, right? If you procrastinate, it's going to kind of force you to be very efficient and get things done. So it's this kind of tongue-in-cheek joke. I kind of forgot the entire thing because I haven't been in the field in a little while, but I think jiu-jitsu is the same way, right? Because if you're just a really kind of, if you contrast it with wrestling, right? Wrestling is very heavily about grit and strength and speed and grinding, and it's okay to just impose your will, right? The famous Randy Couture quote, you want to impose your will. Whereas jiu-jitsu, we really pride ourselves. Well, it's the only sport where being called strong is an insult, right? After someone beats you, it's like, oh, bro, you're so strong. And you're like, how dare you? You know, like it's an insult to be called strong.
It's also the only sport where if someone tells you it feels like you're getting heavier, that's a compliment.
Yeah. And so I think the overlap is heavy in that there's that problem solving because of the grappling nature of jiu-jitsu, it slows things down and you have very recreatable scenarios, right? You can start in a half guard and you can force half guard and drill from half guard and mount. And we have these waypoints. Whereas when it's striking martial arts, kickboxing, boxing, etc., you can kind of do it, but your athleticism and ability to move quickly and time things is very important. And it's very hard, unless you're very, very good at striking, to slow it down to the level where you can just stop and think. But in jiu-jitsu, you can stop and think, and you can replay and recreate the same scenario over and over again, and you can build algorithms You can build heuristics, like all of these exact same tools that lead to an efficient software developer and keeping their mind organized are also very applicable in jiu-jitsu. And you can definitely approach striking that way as well. I think like Coach Barry Robinson is an example, I think, of a coach these days that's kind of trying to take striking in that direction. But a lot of striking is about, tough guy stuff. Let me bang, bro. Like there's still that spirit in the striking world that just being a warrior tends to oftentimes be prided as the key element of it. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, like being slick, being clever, being sneaky, those attributes I think are favored ahead of just being a warrior. Don't get me wrong. In grappling, we still have the guys that are just absolute physical specimens, the guys that just are built on nothing but grit and toughness. That still exists in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and it's still part of the history, culture, and spirit. But I know for me and other people who have backgrounds in software development, science, engineering, etc., the overlap is like, let's create these tools, right? I'm creating my game. I'm creating this clever puzzle that I'm going to throw at you and see what you do. And then based on what you do, I'm going to adjust my game. And I might have an entirely different game that I bring out dealing with the yoga guy who plays rubber guard versus the giant jacked wrestler versus insert whatever jiu-jitsu archetype here. And so that's kind of always been the cool thing for me. Like there's an overlap. There's also an overlap in like kind of nerd culture, like Magic the Gathering and jiu-jitsu. There's definitely an overlap there. And so like it's always been fascinating to me that like getting really heady and really nerdy, like you can do that in jiu-jitsu and you can do it in a way that's very rewarding.
It's funny, I was peeping a Reddit thread the other day where someone was asking about submeta and when their new game planning feature is going to come out. And Lachlan responded and said, he's working with the developers to figure out when. He's not sure, but he thinks it's probably a few months out. He's trying to get an estimate. And I'm sitting there reading this and thinking, I'm just envisioning in my head, Lachlan fucking Giles, of all people, sitting there booting up a Jira dashboard and getting a room of developers together for Scrum and being like, so guys, you said that this was a 5-pointer and it was supposed to be done last week. And, I just want to know why it's not done. And is there anything that we can do to prevent it from overhanging again? Because, when we make these Scrum commitments, the estimate was in line with what it normally is for a weekly plan. Just imagining him sitting there trying to lecture these developers like a Scrum master. I mean, we've probably already lost 90% of the audience here.
Yeah, we were pretty niche here, but you just thing is, I was a Scrum master. Like at one point in time, that was my job. Like so, like it's been so long.
I just triggered some old trauma.
Not even trauma. I actually surprisingly had quite a positive experience with Scrum because as Agile entered my company, my team I think was not but one of the first pilot teams, and we eventually made a transition of the whole company over from Waterfall to Scrum. So I was there for that transition, and like especially for me as a young developer at the time, like Agile was more exciting to me because I get to make changes that get to end up in production sooner. I get to see other people using the stuff that I made sooner versus maybe I would work on a longer term project and in 3 or 4 months, maybe if I'm lucky, it gets released and it's going to get code reviewed and maybe it gets changed. Like, I don't know. I liked the idea of like, I guess being younger at the time, like living dangerous. Like I might break something and we're going to have to fix it, but that's okay.
I took so much from that Agile methodology into jiu-jitsu with me.
Yeah. Fail fast, man. Fail fast.
Yeah. I was shocked at the parallels that I saw between them. Actually, I would love to have you back on at some point to discuss this specifically, like how to learn in an agile fashion versus how to learn in a kind of more traditional, what you'd call waterfall fashion. I know we've already crammed like 3 topics into this.
Here we go. Let's do it. I mean, like I said, I love this kind of stuff. So we can table that for a second and come back to it at a future date. But there's actually a lot. I'm very big on that idea of failing fast, and in which kind of, in my opinion, if you look at what the kind of, because ecological is having its moment right now, right? It went from a thing that like no one really knew what it was, and I can't even claim to be an expert on the eco approach. I've had long conversations with Rob Cole and Preet Mickelson about it, and Chris Paines as well. But I would by no means claim just by having a couple conversations. Oh, also Mike Demko, as like 4 guys I've just had conversations with and read one book. That doesn't make me an expert. But I do think that the idea of setting up goals and letting people throw a bunch of different options at how to solve these goals and then coming away with a takeaway of, okay, these methodologies worked, these didn't, why? And is it my opponent? Is it me? That is something I've been doing my whole jiu-jitsu career, because I've always been the kind of person who, like, I don't just want to win. I want to have fun. And if you just have, because I had way back, high white belt, right before I got my blue belt, I got pretty good at one little sneaky armbar. It wasn't a guard armbar. It was like a gimmicky armbar. But the people around me couldn't figure it out. And I had to stop doing it, because I was just like, I'm not getting any better at jiu-jitsu by exploiting this loophole in the game against my fellow white belts. Like, this is not helping me get better. And then to find, okay, well, what's a different way that I can do these things? And I think that whole idea of this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, and then finally getting these nuggets of gold, these ideas, and then polishing them, that to me has been how almost everything that I teach and do in jiu-jitsu has come about.
Awesome. Well, I guess the message to the listeners then is stay tuned for more Charles, because I think we've already plotted out a bunch of conversations I really want to have with you. But the big thing that we had talked about going into this, you had mentioned that there is, I mean, after all, this is BJJ Mental Models, and you mentioned that there is a specific mental model that you're quite well known for, which has guided you through most of your jiu-jitsu career. And you referred to it as the threefold view. Could you maybe give me a bit of an explanation about this in an intro? Because I think this is a great topic for our first chat here.
I'd love to. So I got this back when I was a blue belt, and I went to a Roy Harris seminar. And it almost felt like a parable, the way he was telling it. And I've digested what he told me back at blue belt and like made it my own. And so this won't be exactly Roy Harris' story, but it's this idea of making a metaphor for jiu-jitsu as if jiu-jitsu was a jungle, right? And if you get into a helicopter or a plane and you fly over a jungle, you can see the general shape of the jungle. You can see where there's lakes, rivers, dense forestation, sparse forestation, maybe some fire burns, but you can just see the general shape of the jungle. And for me, that's your overarching concepts. I call them jiu-jitsu truths. So they're usually these kind of single, elegant sentences. Probably one of the most classic ones that you hear from your coach would be something like position before submission, or something like you want to move things at the ends of levers and you want to control things at the base of levers. All these different, almost like aphorisms that you'll hear about. And these are overarching big principle concepts that should be true. And you will occasionally have to update them when you'll later down the track find things that violate them, and you'll update them better. So for example, I used to say position before submission, but now I say control before submission, because there are controls that are not technically scoring positions in jiu-jitsu that are just as valuable and lead you to a submission. And so I update my language to keep my overarching view as accurate as possible. The second is going to be if I had a tour guide or somebody leading me through the jungle, and they took me on a hike and I walked through the jungle. I'm going to see things I couldn't see before. I'm going to see animals. I'm going to see maybe some more details. I'm going to see the base of those trees I saw above. I might see just all these other things. And to me, those are your individual techniques and combos, your setups and your exits. Those are kind of the general portion of jiu-jitsu. So those would be your guard passes, your sweeps, your throws, your takedowns, your submissions, all of that and how it links together. That's in that second view. It's going to look, the forest looks very different when you're walking through it than it did flying over it. But they always connect, right? Like you remember the map you saw when you were flying over. There's a big tree there. You walk through, the same big tree is there. You just see it a little differently, right? So my concept of position before submission, I understand I need to get to, say, side control before I go for an Americana, usually, and it informs us there. Then finally, if I were to either put my nose on some bark and look in, I'm going to see the ants crawling around. Or if I took some pond water and put it under a microscope, I see these fine details. And those fine details are those tiny little things that you're going to adjust to make things work. Whether you were accustomed to grabbing someone's wrist and now you grab someone's hand to make your leverage just a little bit better. But as you said, I said leverage, ends of levers. I'm being informed from that overarching principle that runs all the way through down to fix my fine details. And the fine details, if you look at anybody who specializes in any technique or any aspect of grappling, they have a very dense amount of detail involved in that thing. Great example would be if you ever listen to or watch Roger Gracie teach a guard armbar. It's immensely dense, right? It's not just the same 5 steps. However, if you take a complete beginner and you try to shove Hodger Gracie's level of detail down their throat, they're going to overload. They can't handle it. It's too much. But they all link back together. So whenever I'm having a problem at any of those levels, I use the other two levels to help me. So I will, when I find a technique that seems to violate my upper division thing, I have to update my concept, I have to update my map if, say, a tree falls down or something changes about that middle level. Or if I have problems with my fine details, let's look, how did we get there? Where did we come from, right? The middle layer is going to help the bottom. And so by simply viewing things this way, I have constant loops that are updating my map of this jungle, because it's 3 different maps, right? It's the things I know about Bart and algae and all these tiny things. It's the paths I know, how I get around and don't die and get bitten by snakes. And then finally, it's the overarching view of the health of the jungle. And I'll keep updating my map of the jungle to understand jiu-jitsu. And that's been the metaphor that I've used a lot to kind of not stagnate, because I had a really bad blue belt plateau. And by letting go of victory as my number one thing and shifting to, I'm just trying to fill out this map. I'm trying to understand more and update my elegant sentences. And it's been very rewarding. So that's the general overarching view of the threefold view of jiu-jitsu as a jungle.
That's actually a really cool analogy. Reminds me of the old saying, you don't know the forest from the trees. This is very much what you're talking about here, where depending on the perspective you're looking at things from, the landscape can be entirely different. And I've had kind of a similar battle trying to map out jiu-jitsu myself as well. I find that a lot of more classic instructors, even to this day, their focus is very technique oriented. You talked about the ecological approach. I mean, there's a whole bunch of approaches to coaching that are coming up in popularity now, which involve taking some distance from a purely technique-based way of training. And I mean, I've been saying since the first episode of this podcast, I prefer to think in kind of a more mental model framework for jiu-jitsu, which is kind of that high-level view you talked about. However, a mistake that many people make, especially earlier on in their journey, is they kind of get hyper-fixated on one view. So you talked about white and blue belts. Understandably, at that level, people are usually hyper-fixated on techniques because, look, at that point, they don't have a working base of knowledge. You've got to start them somewhere. It's like when you are teaching a baby to speak. You don't sit them down and start by explaining the rules of grammatical structure to them, right? You have to give them very basic words, get them to repeat them, and then over years and years of training and practice, they learn the bigger concepts. So that comes with time, but I think a mistake many people make is they will get so fixated on one of those layers, they will forget the others. And I agree with you completely. I've had situations where something at one level of detail has contradicted something else at another level of detail, and I've had to reconcile that. And what I've learned over time is when you do that, when you try to reconcile these 3 levels of detail, what you find is usually you wind up adding a lot of nuance to things. You'll come into a situation and at first, and maybe you'll think, here's the right way to do something. But then eventually you're going to be presented with a counterexample, a situation where that is not the right way, and you have to challenge your thinking. Something I've been talking about a lot on the podcast recently is I used to be an advocate of inside channel control at all times. So always get in tight, get between the legs, get between the arms, get under the head. I would kind of teach that as if it were a universal concept, but there are a lot of grapplers who go around the outside, right? There's a lot of ways that you can build a very effective strategy around that. And that's not necessarily the type of jiu-jitsu I like to play, but it's clearly valid. People succeed at a very high level doing that. So I've had to kind of reconcile and add some nuance in my mind as to when you go inside versus when you go outside. And what winds up happening is you kind of create a spectrum, or what my coach Emily Kwok would call a polarity, where instead of looking at things in absolutes, there's kind of a sliding scale. And the answer is not always a fixed thing. Sometimes, to know the best way forward, you have to look at things at all of these levels. Like, what does the map say? That's all great, but what's actually happening on the ground right now? And then at the most microscopic level, what are the tiny little things I can do that can make or break this? And so I find that as I get older and more experienced, I'm kind of pivoting throughout those layers. But the other thing that I've also found is a mistake that people sometimes make is they think that all of these layers have to map up one-to-one, like it's some sort of universal law of physics, but there's always weird exceptions. As the saying goes, the map is not the territory, right? A map will never fully accurately reflect the territory on the ground, because if it did reflect it to that level of detail, it's not a map anymore. There's no value in a map that fully captures every detail, because the whole point of a map is to be an abstraction. So to some extent, you will find those little holes, and you have to learn to accept that. But also, when you do find those holes, to challenge yourself and to realize, is my map wrong? Like, is this a situation where my map is just not including this detail because it's not relevant for a map? Or is this a situation where I discovered a new trail that my map didn't even know existed, and it's time to go update the map?
Yes. And so that last bit you just said is exactly where a lot of the gold I found in my jiu-jitsu. And so I'll find something where like, this doesn't add up. Well, okay, well, if this exception is true over here, there must be other places where this is true, right? And so one of the big ones I've been tinkering with recently, because historically, right, because like I said, we talked about in jiu-jitsu, you don't like people calling you strong. So for me, it wasn't that, because I have a breakdancing background. When I started grappling, people would discredit a lot of the stuff that I did because I was very acrobatic and very dynamic. And they were like, you're just doing that breakdancing shit. And so it didn't matter what I was doing because I was doing something very athletic. It was suddenly, it's not good jiu-jitsu because, who else is going to do that shit, Charles? Like, you can only do that because of your background. And so like, it took me to a point where I was trying my best to strip out my physicality and my gifts to do good jiu-jitsu. But the cool thing, what I realized is that very often in the quest for physical efficiency, right? We often in jiu-jitsu, we're searching for hyper physical efficiency, meaning that we need the smallest amount of physical effort in order to accomplish a goal. However, in that quest, I think oftentimes we end up at a place that is very physically efficient, but very mentally inefficient, because we've added so much complexity that when it's late in the match and you might still have some physical cardio left because you're in good shape, but your mind is tired, you're not going to hit that move that requires you to do 3 things at once. Your timing is going to be off. Your coordination is going to be off. And so that goes right back to what you were talking about with the situation on the ground. The situation on the ground is that I know a more efficient version of, say, this ankle lock or this triangle, but I know that mentally I don't have the coordination right now given my mental state, because maybe I've been doing a lot of decision making, maybe I'm stressed out, maybe this person's supposed to beat me. All these other things have encumbered my mind. And so this is a situation where occasionally doing kind of the meathead version of the move might actually be the correct solution in that scenario, where you've caught somebody slipping and you have something where like you're going to have to use more physicality, but you have more of that in the bank in this moment than you have mental acuity. And that realization that like occasionally being a goon is okay was very hard for me to accept, because I've always wanted beautiful, elegant jiu-jitsu. I've always been very romanticizing the idea of being able to make things look graceful and effortless. But if my opponent is willing to push all of their physicality chips onto the table, and I'm trying to minimize all of my physicality, eventually the multiplier of my jiu-jitsu won't be enough unless I'm willing to put at least some of my physicality on the table as well to match their physicality. In my view, it's only appropriate for you to have no physicality if you're in a drilling situation or a situation where your opponent is also not using physicality. So like, I'm 185 pounds. I'll regularly roll with people that are north of 300 pounds when I'm traveling around doing seminars and BJJ Globetrotters. I can't turn off my physicality when I'm rolling with someone who weighs more than 100 pounds more than me. I just don't have enough power, even with the efficiency of jiu-jitsu, to affect them. I'm going to have to use some physicality with my technique.
Awesome, man. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in there. And I agree with you completely about the physicality thing. Something that you said, which is really interesting, is you talked about how jiu-jitsu can be a multiplier. And I'd love to unpack that, because this is a realization I had as well. What is jiu-jitsu? Ultimately, you can define it in a lot of ways, but kind of the key thing that makes most stuff work in jiu-jitsu is leverage. What is leverage? Leverage is a force multiplier. By using leverage, I can take whatever force I'm normally able to generate, and then I can multiply that. That's why we do what we do here. But it's important to understand you can still get stuff done without maximum leverage, right? Because at some point, you want to rely on leverage, but at some point, if strength is the only thing that you've got because you can't get leverage, if your strength is sufficient, you can still get results. I mean, like Brock Lesnar, for example, if he grabs me and just suplexes me, it doesn't matter if he's got me by the end of the lever, I'm going to go for a ride. And people are sometimes told by their coach that, don't use strength. And the takeaway they'll have from that is that strength is bad. But that's often not what their coach meant. Their coach meant, don't use strength as a substitute for technique. Don't use strength as a crutch to prevent yourself from learning better approaches and learning how to get leverage. But that doesn't mean don't use strength at all. Strength is a part of who you are. If you are using no strength, then by definition, you have no leverage, because anything times 0 is 0. So you have to use strength to some degree. It's about using it intelligently and safely and not letting it be a crutch for actual skill development.
Yeah, I completely agree. I talk about it a lot. And whenever I'm coaching heavyweights, I have to talk to them about it. I'm like, it's going to be harder for you to get good at jiu-jitsu. And they're like, what do you mean? It's like, you're going to win too much. I had it actually just this past weekend. I was teaching a seminar on framing and the elbow frame. And one of the guys was just a great athlete and he's doing everything wrong. And it was still working. He's like, well, how come? It's like, well, because you're bigger, stronger, faster than your opponent. And so even kind of doing what I'm doing and making a bunch of mistakes, it will still work for you. Conversely, there was a guy in the room that weighed like 135 pounds and his partner weighed like 160 pounds. In the case of that, his mistakes are going to be amplified a lot worse because he's feeling a lot more weight in that mismatch. And so as a heavyweight, you're going to have to either find someone bigger or slow down and be like, did I have to exert myself? If I did, I shouldn't, because I already have the advantage being bigger. If I'm already bigger than you, I shouldn't ever have to strain. And if I'm straining against someone who I outweigh by 50 pounds, I'm not going to make it work against someone my size. So letting go of victory and searching for something more precise of not just winning, but I need to make this thing work and it needs to feel a certain way. It needs to be efficient. As a lightweight, you have a lot of feedback immediately. You do it wrong, it's just not going to work. You're just going to get crushed. You're like, oh, guess that was wrong. And so you have kind of the advantage, but jiu-jitsu is also a lot more demoralizing when you're always losing. So like that's part of why when lightweights get good, like they're practically genies because they had to be so precise for things to work for them. Whereas a Brock Lesnar type character, he can make a bunch of mistakes, but because he's got so much gross raw power, it's still going to work out.
Yeah. It's a good point. And coming back to that metaphor of the threefold view of jiu-jitsu, another thing that you'd also talked about earlier was how it's possible to get overwhelmed in details.
Yes.
I think that that's going to happen to everyone at some point in their journey, especially where they're early on. We might refer to this as cognitive load and just how much stuff you can kind of have in your working memory at the same time. One of the reasons why I like that high level from the helicopter view of jiu-jitsu is because if you can take someone who's just started jiu-jitsu and in their first few months, you can give them a good conceptual framework to understand things, I find it really helps reduce their cognitive load because it's very hard if you just walk into jiu-jitsu for the first time to memorize every single detail that your instructor is throwing at you if they are teaching things in a technique-based fashion. There's just too much. And I would say, at least from my experience, the big challenge I had at white belt especially was just I had to think so much to make anything happen because everything was so new and novel. And I was always getting into these situations that I didn't understand. And so as a result, my cognitive load was just way, way too high. And I feel like this is a great opportunity for people who are newer at jiu-jitsu to go up a level, look at things from the big picture, and if they can find a framework where they can start kind of seeing the patterns and some of the repeating ideas between a lot of techniques and ideas in jiu-jitsu, it makes it a lot easier for them then to actually figure stuff out on the ground and troubleshoot why something is or isn't working. For me, that was a game changer. That's a big part of the reason why we do this thing and we call it BJJ Mental Models is because for a lot of people who aren't thinking in that way, it adds a ton of value. But on the other hand, you're also right that if you're only thinking conceptually, you're denying yourself the opportunity to really get into the reads and figure out the specifics. Like you said, if you talk to anyone who is truly elite at an area of jiu-jitsu, they can teach for hours and hours and hours about a single specific thing. Now, does that mean that's a good way to teach? Not necessarily. Probably not, actually, because you're probably overwhelming people, but it goes to show the amount of specific knowledge they have. I find this a lot of the time when I'm talking to coaches who specialize in an area of the game I'm not very good at. They will often dig into these very specific niche situations and talk about like the tiny micro details that make a difference, but you got to know what the level that someone is at. And often I find a mistake people make is they get too into the reads too quickly, whereas maybe they would be better suited building a conceptual framework before they start worrying about every tiny little what-if scenario.
I completely agree. And I think that it's like I was talking about, I had a pretty epic conversation with Preet Mickelson because we were both debating about prescriptive instruction and details in particular, and when is it appropriate to give details. And so you said it perfectly, right? Like when people who are specialists in an area that you don't necessarily play or aren't very experienced in, and they start going deep down the rabbit hole, you kind of get lost or you're overwhelmed. You're like, what part of this is important to me? Because it's not really important to you. Because right now for you, you're just trying to gain the general scope of what they're teaching you. And you might come away with one or two key details, but unless you find yourself living and breathing every day in this position that they're obsessing over, you're not having the problems that those details are solving. And for me, that's the big thing. Like to me, that was what we came away with after 2 hours of a long conversation over breakfast, was finding out when is the time to bring the details, because you have to still give details eventually. Because for me, it's the details that I have from my experience and that I've got from my previous instructors. That's how we stand on the shoulders of giants. But we don't, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel over and over again. At the same time, like you said, I don't need all those details in the beginning. So what I found is I like to, whenever I'm teaching, I'm going to give the conceptual reason why. Because that's going to give you, like you said, that kind of foundation in your brain. And then when it's time for me to give you specifics, those specifics should relate back to that why. So they have a home in your mind to stick to. Okay, I'm going to move to the end of the arm. Excellent. An arm is a lever. I'm going to the end of the lever to move it. All of it tracks. Beautiful. So my specific thing tracks with my conceptual thing. Awesome. And then once I've been playing with that arm bar or that triangle or that sweep or whatever you're talking about for a while, I'm going to start having problems. And then it's time, let's go and look at that video of Hodger teaching the armbar. Sure enough, one of these details he does, I don't do. And sure enough, that detail is actually a way of preventing a problem I'm having. But I by no means need to obsessively and blindly choose to learn every single detail of the Hodger Gracie guard armbar as a white belt, because I don't even know if I'm going to be an armbar guy. And so you only have so much RAM in your brain. You only have so much data that you're going to become a specialist in. That's why nobody's a specialist in everything. All these great champions, they have a good general grasp of jiu-jitsu in general, but there's plenty of very elite guys that are quite rudimentary in some part of their game because there's not enough room to be that guy in everything. It's just very hard for a human to do.
Yeah. And another thing that I found interesting is that when you get into very detailed specifics, the more specific you get, it seems, the more individualized those specifics become from person to person.
Yep. Body size, flexibility, all of it.
Yeah. When we're talking about things from the bird's eye view, there might be some variance between what we do, and people choose to map out things differently when it comes to a conceptual way of thinking of jiu-jitsu. But at the end of the day, you can give me your map of jiu-jitsu and I can probably understand what it's about. But when you start getting into really specific details, the mistake many coaches make is assuming that the details for them will be the same as the details for everyone else. An example that I've heard many times, I mean, my coach is Emily Kwok. We've had a lot of friends of Marcelo on the show, right? No one has a bad thing to say about Marcelo. But the one thing I do often hear about Marcelo's teaching style is he struggles to understand what it's like to not be Marcelo. So there's some things that he can just do because of his body type, right? Like he's got a very unique body type and he's got very unique physical attributes. And some of those details, you know, he can spend hours teaching you how to do it. But at the end of the day, you might simply not be able to make it work because you are just not Marcelo Garcia. And this is, I mean, if we want to get back to the ecological approach and a lot of other more modernized coaching methods, this is where I think there's value in that stuff because they acknowledge that you cannot just take what works for your coach, have them communicate it to you, and copy it verbatim. There might be some overlap, especially if you're thinking about things conceptually. The idea may be the same, but how the specifics shake out can be wildly different. I beat myself up for a long time in jiu-jitsu because I felt there were certain things I just couldn't do right. I could make them work if I did them my way. Like if I didn't listen to my instructor and I made some adjustments, I could pull it off. But if I tried to do it the way my coach taught me, it would fail. And for a long time, I thought this was a me problem, because if I'm good at jiu-jitsu, I should be able to do it the way my coach taught me, right? Of course, what I know now from the perspective of someone with a lot more experience and access to great coaches like yourself is what I was experiencing was completely normal. And in fact, it was probably on my coach to not make me feel dumb because I couldn't do things the way that they did. We just have different attributes. We do things differently. I've also learned over time that I have to be careful what I teach to people, because I have attributes. There's some things that I can do that I have just not been able to replicate. I do all sorts of crazy Ezekiel chokes, and I have yet to successfully teach other people how to do it. There's just something about the way my arms are built where I can do it a certain way. For me, that's tremendously powerful because no one expects I can do this stuff because no one else can. But it also means I've got to be aware that I can't just tell someone else, well, do it Steve's way, because Steve's way might be individualized. And that's just an interesting example. Another reason why this threefold view is important, because the higher level views make it easier for us to communicate and share ideas. But when you get down to the specifics, I mean, you can still share ideas. It's still worth talking, but you have to be more open to the fact that what you see at the microscopic level might be different from what your buddy sees at that level.
I completely agree. And I think a big thing, the big shift, and you said it when you're saying it, is for me, it's a shift away from doing things correctly to doing things effectively. I'm very careful. I've been trying my best to avoid using that word correct, proper, or et cetera, words like that, unless I'm referring to this is how you do it correctly if you're trying to do it my style. It's not the correct way to do a leg lock or a pass guard. No. It's here is a way that I found effective. I would like for you to use what I'm doing as an inspiration if you can kind of accomplish these goals. And so I've been obsessed with this idea of like certain goals need to be done, right? If I want to pass your guard, I'm going to eventually have to be in the space between your armpit and the back of your knee. I'm going to have to be somewhere in that space. There's no way I can pass your guard without getting some piece of my body into that space. I have to get some piece of my body in that space. Maybe you can claim that the north-south pass is not that, but that's an exception. But in general, so if I make that a goal, hey, class, get into that space however you can. Beautiful. And then they're going to do all the different guard passes their own ways. I only tend to caveat things when someone's doing something that isn't how I've necessarily prescribed or whatever. If it's like, hey, the thing you're doing, I see you breathing heavy. Maybe try to adjust that to a way that's a little bit less exertion for you so that you can do this for a longer period. But that way that you just invented, that might work out great for you. You got 10 seconds left, high amount of exertion. You need to get it done now. Use it. It's going to have its place. And so shifting into let's add some resistance. Is it effective or is it ineffective? And then within this style of, you're going to have more than one way of doing things. I think narrowing yourself down to always doing something the same way every single time makes you very predictable. You're going to need to have B-sides and C-sides and alternate versions of things given your state. How savvy is this person? How flexible is this person? How strong is this person? How tired is this person? And then you're going to adjust what you're doing based on those scenarios. And you can also adjust them based on your own internal feeling. Oh, I'm exhausted. No cartwheel pass right now. I'm too tired for that. I'm feeling fresh. I'm feeling goofy. I'm rolling with a buddy. Cartwheel passes all day. Let's do it.
I got a lot to talk about there, man. I mean, first of all, I would share a story here. When I was a white belt, there was this black belt in the gym. He wasn't really a coach, and man, it showed because his ability to give advice was pretty awful. But I remember one time I was trying to do some move, one of the white belt moves. It was like a scissor sweep or an omoplata or something. I don't know. There was some basic fundamental move they were teaching me, and I just couldn't make it work. And this guy came over and started micro-coaching me and telling me, put your left arm here, do this, raise your knee up by 1 inch. And I'm just getting more and more frustrated and overwhelmed. And it's not working. If anything, it might have actually been working less following this guy's advice. And at some point, I just go over, I just look over and I say, like, this isn't working. I'm thinking to myself, I'm doing what you're telling me, or at least I'm trying to follow all of these instructions you're throwing at me, but it isn't working. It doesn't feel right. And he looks at me really angry, says, well, it looks right. And then he gets up and storms away. And I'm thinking like, bro, like, I don't give a shit if this looks right. I'm trying to do jiu-jitsu here, right? My goal is not to paint a painting. My goal is to armbar this motherfucker. And, I just found that to be kind of a frustrating experience, but something that probably everyone goes through at some point where they're trying diligently to follow this micromanaging coach and they just can't do it because they're not the same person. I mean, I think we've all had experiences like that. And that is, again, another example of why it's just so important to give people that ability to play and figure out their own map and their own details, because the key details for you might actually be different from the key details for me. And the beauty of having multiple ways to look at jiu-jitsu, multiple lenses, like this threefold view, is if we've got individual details, we can still abstract away and talk about commonalities, right? I can put you in any gym in the world and I can have someone show you an armbar and you will immediately say, that's an armbar. Now, at the end of the day, they might have done that armbar in a completely different way from how you would do it. They might have done it in a way that you've never even seen before, but you will recognize that it's an armbar, because at some point we have an agreed upon conceptual definition of what that move looks like.
Yep, the general shape of an armbar.
Exactly. So I think that, again, that's why we have this map, because that's what allows us to collaborate and that's what allows us to simplify our thinking and reduce our cognitive load. But we also have to dig deep into the details, figure those out for ourselves to some degree, and make peace with the fact that what we see when we lift up the microscope and we look at the details, it doesn't always map directly to the map itself. And that's okay, right? But part of our job is figuring out, is this because the map is wrong, or is this because this is a detail that is irrelevant for the purposes of having a map?
Yeah. I think oftentimes it's finding, to go back to like what we're saying, like more than one choice, right? So like I go down to the details and I look, I think a triangle is probably one of the best examples of this, because it's one of like, I think there's a few like marquee Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu moves. And I think guard triangle is one of them. I think rear naked choke, guard triangle, armbar, probably the three most jiu-jitsu iconic moves that you think of. Brazilian jiu-jitsu, you think of, a rear naked choke and a guard triangle, in my opinion. Now, obviously, if you look at how things are developed, the ways people finish triangles are very varied. Some people are staunch. You must be perpendicular to finish a triangle. And then you see other people finishing triangles completely parallel. Other people, well, you should never do this. And then you see other people doing that thing. Well, you need to cross your leg. My legs are too short. And now you're doing the TP from 10th Planet or one of these things. And like suddenly you're realizing like, well, what is important for a triangle? Well, in my opinion, all that's important is there a head and an arm? And are you blocking off their arteries? That's it. Everything else is variable. And to me, finding the essence of any given move, just like you said on the armbar, what's the essence of an armbar that we can have this conversation and have a language that allows us to communicate? That's valuable. But beyond that, there are minimal, like to go back to the software development analogy, like an MVP, right? What's the minimal viable product? What's the essential pieces that if without this, it does not function? And then everything else is serving a purpose. Is that purpose? It could be overcoming resistance of my opponent. It could be weakening my opponent. It could be strengthening me. But that's always going to be the extra bits. And I think for me, at analyzing that, suddenly, well, all of these 18 million details, there's 18 million of them. 4 of them are probably important. The rest of them, you can take them or leave them depending on your scenario. Once I understood that, that's actually what helped me in my defensive journey, because I could start handing people what seemed like a really good submission, but was actually poison. Because like, I know that I've taken away one of the critical pieces of the submission for you, but to you, it's indistinguishable from a real one. And you're going to hand me a guard pass as you try to triangle me or armbar me. You're going to hand me gifts because I'm giving you something that seems like a good opportunity, but in fact it's not, because of my understanding of what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. What you described there is something that my brother has referred to in the past as the critical control points of any technique. My understanding is that's terminology he gets from the culinary world, so something you might appreciate because I know that you're a cooking guy as well.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Yeah, like one point does something stop being an omelet and become a pancake or become a Dutch baby or become something else. That's really interesting. Like, where does the line between two different dishes that are very similar?
Yeah. So when we talk about an armbar, for example, what are the elements that always have to be there that make it an armbar? And then what are the things that are kind of superfluous, things that might vary from case to case, understanding the difference between those two. So to bring that back to your threefold analogy, basically understanding the tiny details at the micro level versus the technique details in the forest. That is a critical distinction, especially for beginners, because sometimes when your coach teaches you something, they'll give you 10 steps to do a move, or maybe 10 details that you need to adhere to. At least you think you need to adhere to them. But in reality, maybe only 4 or 5 of those are absolute musts to make the thing work. The other are there for flavor or they're situational. So again, this is in the ecological world, they would call those critical control points invariants, the things that just, they're always going to be there. And then everything else is basically seasoning on top. That's a really important thing to understand when you get exposed to a new piece of info in jiu-jitsu. You have to ask yourself, is this a critical control point? Or is this an invariant? Or is this a specific detail that is dependent on things like body type, attribute, or the scenario? Because understanding that really helps you narrow down, okay, what do I really actually have to do here if I want this to work? And where can I freestyle? Where are the things where I can make some personal judgments, or I can just wing it, or I can get creative, or I can play to my body type, things like that. Understanding that difference is key. I mean, like you said, with the arm bar, what are we really trying to do with an arm bar? We're trying to immobilize the person's arm. We're trying to make sure the slack is taken out of all three of those joints. We're trying to extend the lever. We're trying to get braking pressure on the elbow. How you do that is really up to you. And I mean, when I started jiu-jitsu, I would hear coaches say things like, never cross your ankles when you armbar someone.
Never cross your ankles. That's the classic one. Everyone said that. And then you watch the best people cross their ankles and it's like, well, they can do that because they're the best. I'm like,
yeah. Or another thing for me was I was under the impression when I started out that if you wanted to armbar someone from guard, you had to do it slowly, deliberately, and follow all of the steps perfectly, right? Like it needed to be so tight and every single inch and little move mattered. And it was just all about keeping this locked in and doing exactly what your instructor told you. But then I'd watch really high level people like Fedor Emelianenko and Ronda Rousey throw up arm bars from guard.
That thing.
Yeah, and it's like, they're not doing it at all this way. And I mean, I'm not going to tell fucking Ronda Rousey how to do an arm bar, right? Why is it that she's able to make this work? And then I realized at some point that all of those little tiny adjustments that I was so hyper fixated on, they're situational. Basically, my coach had made the mistake of giving me too many details at once. I wanted the map, I wanted the view of the forest, and they decided to use that window to pull out the microscope and show me what the bugs were doing. And that was just the wrong level. And because I was a beginner, I didn't have the nuance to understand that, look, what matters is you get the arm exposed, isolated, they can't move the joints, you put on braking pressure. However you do that, it's going to come down to flavor and situation. And I mean, back to the example of crossing your ankles, had to spend some time thinking about this because again, I was told never cross your ankles, but I would see people do it. And the decision I came to at some point was, look, all I want to do is make sure that their far shoulder is immobilized.
Yes.
Yeah, if they can't move their far shoulder, that means they also can't move their near shoulder, and that means they're isolated. So for me, it's a body type calculation. If I am going against someone who is way bigger than me, crossing my ankles is probably not an option because my legs aren't just long enough to feel comfortable from that position. But if it's a small person, I might have to cross my ankles because I got to take away their space. I can't let them have enough room to bridge or hitchhiker or get their arm out. So in those cases, I might cross my ankles because it makes my own legs smaller, but it's a judgment call. And other people may vary. There's so many ways to finish an armbar. There's a lot of ways to finish an armbar where you don't even have both your legs on the far side. So it's kind of an irrelevant debate. And for me, that was a big realization that my coach is info dumping. They're giving me all of the details, but what I really needed to know at that point was what are the critical control points of those moves.
Can I give a small corollary on that ankle cross thing? Because like that was one of those things that always bothered me as well. But then I had the realization. So it was actually an interesting moment where my lack of hip mobility allowed me to understand something a little better than people who had very open hips. So very often for me, people, I think one of the reasons why crossing the ankles is kind of looked down upon is that naturally when you cross your ankles, most people will bias their knees to spread apart and their hips to open, which will oftentimes create slack. Whereas when your ankles are crossed, it is possible to kind of turn your knees inward and pinch. But for me and other people, like I physically could not open my hip to get my leg over someone's head. I couldn't do it. My hips didn't open enough. So I had to swing my whole body and create the angle properly, and I would always have my knees pinched properly. But then I realized, oh, those crossed ankles behind the far shoulder, that's an example of me overcoming resistance. If I have your far shoulder trapped behind my ankles, that's a valuable thing. Even if my hip's slightly open, I can still control you. Whereas in situations like you said, where my feet can't reach there, well then suddenly it's not so much about are my ankles crossed or ankles not crossed. The ankles crossed is a cue for am I applying inward pressure or am I not? And that to me was important. But then I went on to realize that I actually think that my back heeling pressure, controlling their distance was even more important than my adduction. Because I realized, wait a minute, like why am I relying upon a small muscle group, right? Pinching your thighs is decent, but it's nowhere near as strong as a hamstring curl. And once I shifted to hamstring curls, like my arm bars got way tighter compared to when I was trying to pinch people with my thighs. And so that's one of the big things that I focus on now is like, am I using large muscle groups versus small muscle groups? If I can shift anything I can to large muscle groups from small muscle groups, it almost always makes my jiu-jitsu better.
I guess if there's a takeaway here, it's that if you hear a coach telling you exactly what you need to do or exactly what you need to not do, you should always just be a bit skeptical because there are very few absolutes in jiu-jitsu. The thing that you especially want to look out for is if your coach is saying always or never, you should immediately start thinking about whether your coach is maybe making a mistake there. I mean, coaches are human, right? Either they aren't properly seeing things from the perspective of their students, or maybe they just slipped up in their explanation. I mean, you talk, believe me, I of all people know this. If you talk long enough and frequently enough, you will eventually make an ass of yourself and say something dumb or wrong. So don't assume that just because your coach said something that it's the right answer. And that's not a knock on your coach. That's just an acknowledgement of the fact that we're human. So whenever your coach gives you an absolute, like never do this or always do this, you should always do a bit there. I'm doing it. See, I'm saying always, but you should think about whether that's actually a universal truth or what the coach is really trying to communicate there.
Yeah, I think just figuring out why, because almost always it's a situation where they're trying to simplify something for the place you're currently at in your journey. And I think that's the real reason, the biggest one, right? Jiu-Jitsu, never show your back. And then fast forward to like, I show my back all the time with very little consequences. Well, why? Well, because they didn't believe that a beginner could handle showing their back without getting it taken. So to simplify things, just don't show your back. You have to worry about people being on your back but it's, in my opinion, oftentimes an oversimplification. I think a lot of those absolutes, they're not really the coach thinking never or always. It's the coach believing that at this stage of your development, we're just going to take this variable away from you. I just personally think that I don't want to take those variables from you. I want to treat you like an adult and treat you like someone, because there's a lot of jokes that kind of infantilize and like treat white belts like they're fucking morons and stuff. And I don't think it's necessary. I think that your white belts are going to be as perceptive or as naive as you give them credit for. If you have the expectation of them, like, I'm going to give you reasons and I'm going to expect you to understand reasons. And you're going to have to digest that. They're going to probably grow slightly slower in the beginning, but it will benefit them in the long run. But it all depends on their goals. If their goal is, I don't want to think, I just want to win. All right, I'm going to give you some hard and fast rules that are not the most precise, but they'll get you there. And I think that your language is going to be based upon the goals of your students. I almost always treat my students as if they want to be fellow scientists. But occasionally you're going to have a student who just wants to be a monster and they don't want to think. Just tell me what to do, coach. And I can't force them to want to be a scientist if they don't want to. If they don't want to be a tinkerer and create their own stuff, they just want me to give them my most efficient move and they want to ape it. Sometimes I got to do that for them because that's what they want.
Yeah. I do love when black belt coaches kind of are super condescending to their white belts and talk about them like they're idiots. Because it's funny because most of the time the white belts in the room are like professionals with degrees.
Yeah, they're doctors, lawyers, professors. Like
no big, just like a neurosurgeon. Whereas the black belt dropped out of high school in grade 7 because math was hard, right?
You know? And so like it's very dangerous to do. You never. That's the cool thing and the scary thing about it. You never know who's in class with you. Yeah, I'm a black belt. This blue belt, for all I know, like cured cancer. Like I should probably, like it's very possible. Especially like big city jiu-jitsu, you have no idea who's on the mats with you. Like some of these people are absolutely brilliant. They just have been doing your hobby less time than you. And like, I'm all about respect and like, I value the time I've put into this activity that I've been doing my whole life, but I have no illusions that somehow it makes me a better, more valuable human than someone simply because the color of my belt is different. I think that I got to keep myself grounded because it's very easy. And I've seen it in many professions. I've seen software developers who think everyone else is a moron. I've seen doctors who think everyone else is a moron, scientists. Generally, if you do a hard thing, there's a subset of people who will believe that your hard thing is the only hard thing done on earth. But I find that it's more valuable to be like, I do this hard thing. There are other people who do other equally challenging things. I should respect them versus presume that the thing I do is the hardest thing on earth.
Yeah, that's actually a great example. If we do that follow-up episode on agile methodologies, I'd love to talk about that because developers especially, and I say this as a former developer, so, this is not me throwing shade, but they have a tendency to assume that their answers are always right and everyone around them is a moron preventing them from achieving their true brilliance, right? Like if you've been a scrum master, that's a hard job because a lot of developers, they want the scrum master to get the fuck out of the way. They don't want them to do anything. They think of them as a detriment, if anything. And that's just because they don't understand the forest for the trees. Coming back to the map analogy, they see the code they write and they think it's the only thing that matters. They see everything else around it, like management and marketing and operations, and they think that, that's all the bullshit. The stuff that really matters is the code. But I mean, look, if you've worked in enough areas of that field, you will eventually understand that there's a lot of brilliantly written code that doesn't make a dollar and no one ever uses.
It's, like the old jokes, right? Resume-driven development and, vanity-driven development, like that'll happen sometimes. I was very blessed that because I had kind of done everything. At one point in time, I was a member of the business. One point in time, I was an analyst and a software developer. Because I had worn all the hats, my team was pretty amazing and I never had to deal with that much of that. And that because I showed that I was able to speak tech, but also in the case of the business that I understood why we were doing what we're doing, it put me in a pretty unique and good situation where I had actually a really good relationship with the developers on my team because honestly, they were who taught me to become developers. I was a self-taught software developer, but I was mentored by the very developers I ended up becoming a scrum master for later. That relationship of mutual respect really goes far. And I think that that's kind of the same thing in jiu-jitsu. Different people have different little arbitrary hoops they want people to jump through before they're going to treat them like people. Like we've all been to jiu-jitsu gyms where if you haven't rolled with anybody yet and proven you're a tough guy, like they treat you with disrespect sometimes. But once you have a hard roll with a purple belt or a brown belt or one of their black belts, okay, he's not full of shit. He's not a fake black belt. Now I can treat him with dignity and respect.
I saw on Reddit a while back, there was a really well-known black belt on there who was posting some content, like a very experienced, respected member of the community. And they posted something up there and someone replied and was like, "You've never won a world championship. You don't know shit. Why should I listen to you? Get the fuck out of here with this stuff." And I'm thinking okay, you would never, ever say to that coach in person because that coach would tie you up into a pretzel. But beyond that, I'm not a fan of this gatekeeping, right? And especially if it's like white and blue belts, I really don't need them to gatekeep who's allowed to teach and who's not when they're talking about people who are way more experienced than them. And the opposite applies too as well, right? I think it is very dehumanizing and very self-limiting as well for a coach who's a black belt to assume that less experienced people have nothing to teach. That is a catastrophic mistake for your own skill development and also for the culture of your gym, because you should and can learn from everyone. And if you're not able to learn from them, that just means that that's a failing of you as a coach to help empower people and give them an area of ownership.
But I think that it's a big problem, but I think it's also, it's a human problem, right? So I remember back in college when I took a technical writing class, they talked about the, pathos, logos, ethos, right? Either you believe something because of how it makes you feel, because of who it's coming, because of logic and reason, or because of the source, right? Roger Gracie is considered one of the greatest of all time. Whatever he says must be right because he's Roger Gracie. I do this move because here is the leverage, here is the physics, here are the reasons behind why this move is effective. Logic. This move, I do it and I feel good. That's feelings, right? Those are kind of your three reasons. Or maybe you saw a move in a competition and someone did it, you got really excited. You felt excited, you want to do that move, right? I think that in jiu-jitsu, we get really caught up on the ethos of things. What have you won? Who is saying it? Mind you, there are plenty of great competitors who are not very good instructors. It'd be simply because they didn't put the time into becoming great communicators. They put time into becoming monstrous competitors. And at the same time, I think very often, and I've seen situations where my fiance, Natasha, she's a blue belt, and she's been training for 4.5 years now, and she teaches alongside me, and we've had situations in seminars where someone will ask her a question, or not even ask a question, she'll try and correct somebody, and they'll be like, no, because she's a blue belt. And then I'll come by and say the exact same thing, and they'll listen to me because I'm the black belt, and I'm in charge. And it's just it's very frustrating because I think that we should always have reasons why things work. And as long as you have a reason besides because I'm coach, then it should fly. But oftentimes people don't want to hear that stuff from a source that they don't believe should be giving it, right? And so that source, even if it's a white belt, I've had white belts do shit that's better than what I do. Why? Because they don't have the mental restrictions I've had for my years of being told what to do and my experience. And so they'll do something naturally. They'll be like, hey, do that again. Or even Natasha, my fiance, like she'll do some shit and I'll be like, that's actually better or more efficient or serves a purpose of something I haven't seen before. Can you please do that again? But it's so hard because as people, we're very easily deceived, right? Like in the year 2024, there are still people who join cults. There's still people who are following those no-touch knockout artists. There's still people that believe that they can shoot like fireballs at each other and chi balls. Like all of that is still believed. Not to take anything away from Eastern medicine, chi meridians, all of that. Like I've been to Eastern doctors and it's great, but a lot of those people are just con artists. And so because people can be conned, we're so skeptical and so afraid of being conned that we stick on ethos and we're like, well, I just need, if they've won the world championship, I know they must be good because that's a real measure of being skilled. However, I think that if we can step into why does it work? Because if you have the receipts as to why it works, it doesn't matter if it's a white belt, blue belt, purple belt, brown belt, or a black belt saying it. It just is. It's not debatable. Like it works. And then if you try to do it and it works, does it really matter if you learned it from Hodger Gracie or some random blue belt at your gym? Does it work?
Absolutely, man. Well, this is a great way, I think, to tie this one up. We are talking here now a little bit about coaching, and I would love to get you back on and discuss this in a bit more detail. But one of the things that I know you do, you put out a lot of content, both on YouTube, on your Patreon. You've also got instructionals on BJJ Fanatics, and I know you do one-on-one coaching remotely and in person for people who are looking for a good second opinion. Why did you go ahead and plug that stuff? Tell people where they can find you and how they can work with you or check out your content.
Beautiful. So my name's Charles Harriott. Harriott is spelled Harriott. I say that because that's my name on everything. On Instagram, it's Charles Harriott. On Patreon, patreon.com/Charles Harriott. On YouTube, Charles Harriott. My email is Charles Harriott, my website, charlesharriott.com. So I have been building the Patreon. I'm really happy about it. I produce videos. Sometimes they're breakdowns of roles, sometimes direct answers to questions, instructionals. But what I've really been falling in love with is the two top tiers. One is where I make you a custom video every month. Just you send me your questions. Could be one question, two question, and I will just create a custom video answering those questions. And then you'll talk to me and we'll get feedback back and forth and make the amount of videos that are needed to answer your question, and then the next month we'll do it again. The other is Zoom private lessons. I just had an amazing experience. Probably the second or third time I've done this with this client of mine in Tennessee, and both he and his wife, he went over an entire knee bar system, and every week we went through different scenarios and trying to stay on top, and it was really fun to hear each week as they came back, like, okay, this is what I've been going through. And just through Zoom, even never actually being there with them, watching their success and hearing the feedback, okay, well, they're doing this, well, all right, and then being able to adjust it. I really love private lessons. I love small groups just because I can get that individualized feedback and help you make progress. The messages I get from people about, hey, I was using this or using that, and this guy who's been smashing me for years, I just stood up. Or this guy who always beats me up, I got a knee bar. Like, I personally, even though I know that the instructionals and all of that are less work for me, I guess kind of the warm and fuzzy feeling, the reason I'm a teacher, that feeling of eureka impact, I get it the most with the private lessons. So I would love to try and help you solve your problems. Please check me out on Patreon, or if you just want anything custom, message me on any of those platforms. I would love to help.
Awesome, man. Well, I will make it easy for people. I will put links to all of that stuff in the show notes. So if you want to learn more about Charles, his instructionals, his content, get some one-on-one work with him, just go to the show notes in your podcast player and there will be a bunch of links for you to click. Or alternately, if you go to bjjmentalmodels.com, you can find the show notes there as well. And with that said, I will also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. Almost 300 episodes of this thing now. All of them are intended to be timeless capsule lessons that you can pull out. People listen to stuff way back from episode 1 5 years ago and still get a lot of value out of it. So don't feel that just because the episodes are older, that means you can't listen to them. We've also got an awesome newsletter. It's been growing like crazy, over 10,000 people on there now, and that's also completely free. You can sign up from the website too, and I definitely recommend everyone at the bare minimum do that, just because we give away a lot of great content and even some free instructionals sometimes to people who sign up for the newsletter. So really, there's nothing to lose by getting onto that. If you want to go up to the next level with us, BJJ Mental Models Premium is how we pay the bills. It's the reason why the show has always been and hopefully will always be ad-free. If you don't know what Premium is, it's the world's largest library of Jiu-Jitsu masterclasses on concepts, strategy, tactics, mindset, philosophy. You don't have to pay a la carte. Everything all in one subscription. You can cancel anytime. You also get access to some kick-ass premium podcasts by people such as Emily Kwok, Johannan, Drew Foster. You can only get those on BJJ Mental Models Premium. And we also have a coaching tier as well. So again, Charles, I agree with you completely. I think it is a massively underutilized option that people have, especially people who maybe they're in an area where they don't have a lot of high-level coaches available, or maybe they're in a really busy gym and they just can't, even if their coach is great, they just can't get a lot of one-on-one time with their coaches. I would also say too that doing things remote allows you certain benefits that you don't always get when you're doing something in person. And I'm sure you've encountered this, Charles. If I'm doing a one-on-one private with you in person, or if I'm in your classroom, if something happens, it's kind of ephemeral. It just comes and goes. Whereas if you give me footage of yourself rolling, I can microanalyze exactly what's happening. I can tell you exactly where the problem was, and I can show you exactly what you need to do to fix that problem. It's very hard to do that if you're a coach and you're just sitting there watching a live roll and barking out advice, right? I personally feel that you're going to be much better off recording your footage, getting feedback. So Charles is an option. We also offer services like that too if you go up to our coaching tier. But again, all of that's on bjjmentalmodels.com, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes too. But Charles, man, this is great. I'm glad to finally have you on here. I've been looking forward to this for a while. And yeah, I want to get you back on. There's a lot of stuff to talk about with you.
I would love to. This sounds like a great plan, and thank you so much.
You are welcome, sir. You have a great day. Thanks to you, and thanks to the listeners as well. We'll talk to you next week. See you soon.